Hey, I'm Alex Radical from Board Game Co, and today we're talking about CMON's exclusivity agreement with Gamefound. If you missed it, basically they announced on Friday, but Polygon has an article, Gamefound has an article, but effectively CMON has an exclusivity agreement with Gamefound to use their crowdfunding and their pledge manager going forward. And before we dive into any of this, huge disclaimer, or just making sure you're aware, that I do work for Gamefound. I've been CMO of Gamefound since August of 2022, and that introduces a huge degree of bias in, well, anything I say, and I hesitated whether I should or shouldn't do this video as a result, because old Alex would have happily embraced this subject, because frankly this is big crowdfunding news and I'm very entrenched in crowdfunding. I cover a lot of crowdfunding, so this is obviously something I should be talking about. But then I have to be mindful of the bias, of those conflicts of interest, and so that had me like, do I, don't I? And I decided I wanted to. I wanted to get into the conversation, but more than that, this video may or may not be for you, because normally when I talk about things like this, I try to hedge back my opinions as much as possible, and I just won't be doing that here. I will not be hedging my opinions. I will be embracing wholeheartedly how I feel about Gamefound, which is very positive, and granted that comes with a bias, and you should know with a bias, but I just don't think it makes sense to tackle this subject without actually having my opinions in the mix, and if that makes this a video that's not for you, totally respect that. If you do want to continue, let's get into a few small things. First of all, CMON's joining Gamefound, and joining is not the right terminology, exclusivity agreement. I've already seen a few people on social media, wondering if there's some sort of investment stake behind the scenes, if some sort of partnership that goes beyond just using them as a crowdfunding platform and pledge manager, and I won't go into the terms of the agreement, but I will say there's not an investment stake behind the scenes. That's not what's going on. CMON and Gamefound, two separate entities, no shared ownership of Gamefound at all between those entities. Past that, I'm not going into details on the actual agreements. But I'll also say, while we're clearing things up, I'll also say I've had a lot of people reach out to me congratulating me on CMON joining the platform and assuming that I had a big hand to play in that, which, first of all of you people are lovely. Thank you, I'm very flattered. But I'll also say that this was definitely not a me thing. I am responsible for a lot of creators joining the platform. I'm very happy with the work I do for Gamefound, but in the case of CMON, this is definitely a very much a team effort, and one in which, while I certainly played a part, I would argue a minor part. I don't want to take credit for what a lot of other people on the team have put a lot of work and effort into making happen. Past that, let's go ahead and talk about this. This is big news. This is big news. It has to be big news. Polygon recently put out an article, not just on this, but they put out two articles recently. One talking about how Kickstarter had seen a decline year after year, and they were again on a second decline from what was previously a growing category in the tabletop category. They are now 2 years declining. And then they put out an article a few days later talking about crowdfunding as a whole was up. I did a video on this as well. I'll link to it down below. But I did a video on on crowdfunding trends as well, talking about the top 10 crowdfunding games, where things were, crowdfunding as a whole, who has a slice of the pie, all of that stuff. But again, between that video and between Polygon's most recent article on the subject, they basically correctly identified that Gamefound has taken a big chunk out of the crowdfunding space. Tabletop crowdfunding is actually up this year compared to last year, but Kickstarter is fairly down because that's a combination of, I can't remember the exact chunks, but they're down like maybe $40 million, and that's partially because Gamefound was up $56 million, or Gamefound's at $56 million, I should say, and then that combined with Backakit, also taking a chunk of the pie as well, especially with Gloomhaven bringing in $5 million alone. That means that there's a lot of growth in the tabletop crowdfunding space, but Kickstarter is a bit of a decline, Gamefound's seeing huge numbers up, and Backakit, I don't know if I have as much transparency or visibility into their numbers, unfortunately. And then with CMON joining the platform, it's a big extra amount on top of that. If you don't know already, CMON is the most prolific crowdfunding creator by a large factor. They are nearly double the highest, closest other person in the tabletop crowdfunding space. There's a site, oh my gosh, Tabletop Analytics, I want to say it's Tabletop Analytics. I'll link to it down below if I remember. But there's a site that tracks a lot of things from ongoing projects. It only tracks Kickstarter. Unfortunately, we don't have Gamefound mixed in. I don't know of a tool that merges Kickstarter and Gamefound. If you know of one, please let me know. But past that, Tabletop Analytics has, if you look at the top creators, you have CMON coming in at $106 million raised across all of their campaigns. The second highest creator is Awakened Realms, and on that platform, technically the second highest creator is Steamforged. Depends how you look at it, because on Tabletop Analytics, Awakened Realms coming in at $29 million, but then they have an additional $35 million they've brought in on Gamefound since launching projects over there, which means at this point Awakened Realms has launched more on Gamefound, or has raised more on Gamefound than they have on Kickstarter, bringing you to a total of, what is that, $64 million. We have a CMON coming in, CMON, I'm going to mix it up throughout the whole video. I'm trying to say it correctly. I always say CMON, and I'm just like, whatever. But I'm trying to say CMON here correctly because, you know, news and all that stuff. But anyways, CMON's coming in at 106 million, so that means Awakened Realms at 64 million is the second highest. You have Steamforged at 33 million. You have Dwarfen Forge at 23 million. And then you have Cephalosphere at 23 million, and that's, again, combining 18 million on Kickstarter plus 5 million over on BackerKit. Those are the top 5 creators in the board game space, which means, again, number 5 is 23 million. Number 1 is 106 million. CMON definitely moves the needle. They definitely have a huge influence. They launch, you know, 4 to 5 crowdfunding projects every single year, and for them, a crowdfunding project that brings in $1 million is often viewed as a letdown. If you look at the general audience, like, oh, that one's barely making money because it's only at $1 million, which is insane because for most creators, that is a huge project. I think their average revenue per project, I believe, is I want to say 1.9 million, but it might be a little less than that. But their average revenue per project is pretty high, but they do have those that raise 4, 5, 7 million, and then they have those that might bring in $800,000 and call it a day. They definitely are, well, again, their small projects are still large by other creator standards. And that is big news. It's big news because Gamefound does well. Gamefound has been doing well. Gamefound has continuously been growing. They did, 27 million. We did 27 million last year and did 56 million this year, more than doubled in volume. And telling you from the things we know that are coming in publicly, as well as the things I know privately that are coming in, 2024 is looking like a good year for Gamefound. And the biggest critique against Gamefound has always been, sure, your features are great, but do you have the audience? Do you have enough people on board? Do you have the same audience size that Kickstarter does? Just because your tools are better, does that mean that you're able to bring in enough of a crowd that it makes sense to launch your projects there? And it is a snowball effect kind of conversation. The practical reality is if people agree that the tools are there, and the biggest concern is the audience, and if Gamefound is growing at the rate that it's growing, and creators are moving over, and CMON announces a exclusivity agreement, and you have a whole bunch of other creators who follow suit, a whole bunch of other creators who are looking at this and deciding, if I was on the fence now, maybe now is the time. Maybe now, when other creators are moving forward, do I go ahead and jump on this snowball as it continues to pick up speed, because it is going to continue to pick up speed. I don't know what 2024 has in store. I don't, but I do know that Gamefound is doing well, and I know that creators are very interested, and I know that there are a lot of creators that we haven't even announced, as far as, again, the we being the Gamefound side, that Gamefound has not even announced yet their inclusion or any sort of agreements or conversations. There is a whole interesting sub-conversation, which let's go and get into it. Let's get into the sub-conversation about the nature of the platform wars. Because I remember a while ago, Steamforged announced an exclusivity agreement with Kickstarter, where they had an exclusivity. They're launching their project only on Kickstarter, and again, they're currently the 3rd highest tabletop creator. It's the Steamforged games at 33 million is the 3rd highest tabletop creator. But then you had a bunch of Gamefound at the time, kind of shortly, a few months later, started announcing a bunch of Pledge Manager exclusivity agreements. A bunch of companies announced and dedicated, hey, we are locked in for Gamefound's Pledge Manager. We're signing, this many years, that many years. We're signing in, and we're exclusively using Gamefound for our Pledge Manager. And I remember at the time, there were a bunch of conversations around, like, these are kind of reminiscent of the Xbox and the PlayStation wars. We have the console wars. We have this exclusive, we have that exclusive, we have these things on that console, and those things on this console, and that's only on PC, and this will show up at PC 2 years later. And those are interesting conversations, because those console wars were things that weren't necessarily good for the consumer. Forcing the consumer to buy 2 different consoles to be able to utilize different things, to be able to get access to Spider-Man or Monster Hunter World or whatever game you're trying to get your hands on, those are things that are companies trying to sell their games, locking in exclusives, but possibly at a downside to the customer. This is no different than the streaming wars we're seeing, where you have streaming companies launching different TV shows or movies, making the way to different platforms. You have companies, bidding $50 million to get their hands on Friends, so that is the streaming platform that has Friends, because that still draws in eyeballs to this day, a ton of eyeballs to this day. And certain kinds of wars, console wars, streaming wars, can be not advantageous to the consumer, because the consumer is effectively forced to buy into different subscription services. None of that is true here. None of this is actually bad for the consumer, in my opinion, I should say. I think these exclusivity kind of conversations are a kind of fight between the various platforms hosting campaigns, between BackerKit, between Gamefound, between Kickstarter. And it is interesting in the way those things are going to manifest, because it effectively results in platforms chasing companies and courting companies and trying to lock them in, which is all happening, all these different conversations are trying to get people to exclusively use your platform to bring people over. The reason it's not bad for the consumer is because you're not locked behind a paywall of a subscription service for streaming or buying a console for whatever game you're playing. The consumer is only locked behind a new password and account created on a new site. Gamefound, Kickstarter, BackKit, none of these have subscription services, although with the way crowdfunding marketing is going, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we do start having subscription services. I will say if Gamefound has them, I don't know anything about those plans. So we have no plans that I know of to start a subscription service for Gamefound. But that means that these conversations are effectively good for the consumer or neutral for the consumer, while effectively has companies trying to chase each other and trying to provide the best features. Even now, if you look at Kickstarter, how much Kickstarter has iterated and developed its functionality over the past 2 years compared to how much it has done over the 10 years prior, it feels like Kickstarter has done more in the past 2 years than all the past 10 years combined, and the reason for that is competition. Competition is good for the crowdfunding space. Competition forces every platform to be on its toes, try to bring the best to the table. No one can afford to sit on their laurels. No one can afford to sit there and say, hey, we're just going to go ahead and coast, because you can see what happens when you decide to coast, in the sense that Gamefound, within 2 years of coming to market as a crowdfunding platform, has already taken a quarter of the tabletop crowdfunding market, which is insane. That's like a new phone company showing up tomorrow and then taking 25% of the various market share within 2 years, which is absolutely insane. And then to sign and bring on board an exclusive agreement to bring on board the largest tabletop creator in the space, it is an absolutely huge deal. But these things are good they're good or neutral for the consumers, and they just have the companies fighting each other to try to make sure that they are offering the best possible platform to go ahead and bring people on board. I will say Gamefound's not all perfect. Something that I talked about in my last video about the subject, but Gamefound's interesting because it started off of a whole bunch of people who had used them for Pledge Manager, and then a whole bunch of people who were there for ISS Vanguard. That was the core audience for Gamefound. The very first project launched as a crowdfunding campaign was ISS Vanguard from Awakened Realms, which remained their largest, most funded Gamefound campaign for a long time. Chip Theory Games, Elder Scrolls almost took over briefly. They were shy by like $200,000. I was like, please beat it. I want someone else to go ahead and take the mantle. And then later that year, Nemesis Retaliation took the mantle to the tune of $12.2 million raised, which is absolutely insane. The third highest crowdfunding campaign, just shy of King of Death Monster, a little shy of Frosthaven, almost crossing that finish line. I do want someone to eventually take the mantle. I want the ante to continuously be upped. But effectively, Gamefound started with that ISS Vanguard audience. And that means that Gamefound has a particular kind of backer who started off. And the platform has grown across the board. It has grown and continued to iterate and develop and brought more people on board. But there are people who look at the platform and correctly see that, yes, Gamefound's doing a tremendous job in the tabletop category. They are knocking out of the park. A vast majority of larger creators who, if you're looking at apples to oranges, comparing between Gamefound and between Kickstarter, for the most part, the campaigns on Gamefound seem to be doing better. There's never going to be 100% across the board, but for the most part, the campaigns on Gamefound seem to be doing better if you're in that middle to larger creator size. If you're in the smaller creator size or a lighter game or an RPG, those are areas where you still see successes on Gamefound, but it's not as across the board obvious. And that's something that we are working on. I should say, if you are a creator who's interested in joining Gamefound, if at any point you want to reach out, feel free to use our contact form, or you can email me directly at a.radcliffe@gamefound.com. The email is down below if you want to go ahead and have a conversation, especially if you are an RPG creator, because right now we are very motivated in continuing to grow the areas of the platform that we are still, a little weaker than. We're trying to continuously grow the RPGs, continue to make it so that we are not just the best place for tabletop games, board games, but also for tabletop RPGs. We want to expand the audience that have an interest in lighter games as well, and lighter games and that smaller creators who are bringing things to the platform, because the typical Gamefound customer is a pro and a con depending on what type of creator you are. The average Gamefound customer is a little bit more cynical about what makes sense to back or not back. They spend more money, but they're more particular about what they spend their money on. So many things that might have an easier time funding on Kickstarter because it doesn't necessarily look as polished or ideal, or may not be a final product that's as good. The typical Gamefound customer is a little bit more, I think they're a little bit more savvy in crowdfunding. This is not their first rodeo. This is something that they've been here for a longer time, and that means they are pickier about the kind of projects that they tend to take on. They also tend to like miniature games and narrative games and deluxeifications and all that, although again, that audience is expanding. We have different campaigns like Witchstone, Witchblood, Witchbound, whatever it was. There was like a small little campaign that did like, $200,000 on the platform, and like it did tremendously well, and we've seen continued successes. Right now, as we speak, we have two RPG projects currently doing fairly well on the platform, and Again, that's a segment that we are continuously trying to improve upon and grow upon. We are looking to constantly expand that reach and expand the audience of what the platform is, because we want it to be the best place for crowdfunding in general. We want this announcement from CMON to be not the first, not the last, but the first of many other creators who are looking at the platform and saying, this is where we want to host our campaigns. This is where we want to be. This is where we think the future of tabletop crowdfunding is, because Gamefound is a platform that continuously iterates and develops and continuously builds new features. There's going to be more Gamefound content on this channel over the next few weeks. I don't know exactly what's coming up. I know I'll be commenting on the whole Awaken Realms Next presentation coming. If you missed that, Awaken Realms Next is their presentation they did last year, where they're basically like, hey, here are the campaigns that are coming this year, and these are the things you should be excited about, and I know what's coming, and they are things you should be excited about. But I will be talking about those in a, I don't know exactly how, maybe a live reaction or a next day reaction. I'll figure it out. We'll be talking about those, but that's going to be a bunch of things coming to the platform in 2024. There are a bunch of other creators who will be announcing their lineups, and of course we have our continued Gamefound Feast where we talk about the projects that are going to be joining. There are a lot of things coming. A lot of campaigns. You will very likely be interested in some degree of these campaigns. And I'll say this as well, especially if you're a smaller creator, but honestly anyone. If you are someone who is using Gamefound, if you ever want like some hard advice on your page on how things are, what things are looking like, what you can do to improve, what should be changed or different or better, or if you just want to know, if you want to have a conversation about whether Gamefound's the right platform for you, any of those things, feel free to email me. a.radcliffe@gamefound.com. My email's in the description. But if you're using Gamefound or on the fence as to whether to use Gamefound, I'm happy to have a conversation with you. I'm happy to look over your page, or at least try to find the time to look over your page, to look over what can be done, because I want, whether you're a huge creator on your 7,000th campaign, or whether this is your first campaign ever, I want it to be the best possible experience it can be. And to some of you, if that means directing you to Kickstarter and telling you Kickstarter is a better platform or Back is a better platform, I'll do so. I have no problem with that. I want to be very direct about the pros and cons of what Gamefound has to offer, because I believe that competition is good for the industry. I believe having different platforms that have their strengths and the things they're good at, I believe that's good for the industry. I think it's good for creators. I think it's arguably good for the platforms. It means that no one can just sit still forever and then immediately be overturned by the next large creator who comes in trying to, make a big change or difference in the space. I think it's definitely good for creators and consumers alike, because it gives them options. It gives them tools. It ensures that everyone is trying to be the best they can be. I'm very excited about CMON joining Gamefound. I'm very excited. CMON has always been one of my favorite game companies out there. The sheer quantity of CMON games in my collection that I love, that I enjoy, that I have so much fun with. It's incredibly exciting to see them join a platform that I am a part of. It's cool. It's just cool. I like it. And so, yeah, that's the news. CMON's joining Gamefound exclusively. And we'll see who else follows. And in any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. Hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.